Okay, we're on week 3, the macromolecules or the molecules of life. The first one we're going to be talking about is carbohydrates. Again, I expect that you've all heard of carbohydrates in some form or another. You're probably thinking of breads or pasta or maybe potatoes. And maybe some of you actually are thinking that, well, aren't those all sugar? And isn't that what carbohydrates are? And you are, in fact, correct. So carbohydrates are simply sugars. And we're going to find out that there's the monomer, there's the single building blocks, those are the monosaccharides, and then those get built up together, forming those polysaccharides. And the key things for these sugars is really the only elements they've got are carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, most of them in this general formula, but of course there's always some that don't fit that exact form, but they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we're going to see the two major things that they're used for is energy and structural materials, but it's going to depend on what sort of organism is using them. So the monomers for carbohydrates, again, are called monosaccharides. Again, that word mono. They can be in different forms. They can have linear forms, and then they actually will curl up into a circle and form a ring. There are carbohydrates that have 6 carbons. Glucose, we're going to see, is going to be like the major theme of this course. We're going to be talking about glucose, how we break it down, and how plants build it up. So glucose, you'll see there. Fructose, though, you'll see is almost the same. Galactose, another one of those 6 carbons. There's 5 carbon sugars as well, like ribose. This one we're going to talk about at the end of the macromolecules. And for nucleic acids, it's going to be important. So monosaccharides, the ones I talked about already, like glucose and fructose, they actually have the exact same formula. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, but they have a different structure. The term for that is an isomer. And again, we have to think about these carbons with these 4 different bonds and how they're layered out or how they're laid out in 3D space. That same letters, different arrangement ends up being a different molecule. For those more English derived, it's kind of like an anagram. A decimal point equals, I'm a dot in place. Again, you move the same letters, move them around. So we think about building things up. If we're building polysaccharides from single monosaccharides, is that a hydrolysis reaction or a dehydration reaction? Hopefully you picked up that's going to be a dehydration reaction. We are building up, not breaking down. When you have built up a molecule going from monosaccharides to polysaccharides, you are forming glycosidic linkages. You're connecting that monomer to another monomer. Glycosidic linkage is just the name for that linkage between. And you can actually have different forms of linkages depending on which carbons in those rings are bonding. Here we can see we have a disaccharide 2 monomers linked together, forming sucrose and lactose. And then we're going to see that we are going to be able to form polymers. This is kind of interesting thinking about people. You often heard of high fructose corn syrup. What is it? You're taking starch, a polymer, you're breaking it down to glucose, the monomer, and then you artificially are converting that 6 carbon sugar with one form into its isomer into fructose. So that's what high fructose corn syrup is. You're taking corn and you're converting it into that sweet, sweet molecule that we love. But now for the complex carbohydrates, for the polysaccharides of carbon. We're going to see again, there's 2 different types we're looking at, energy reserves and structural components. And we're going to see that these complex carbohydrates are all based just on glucose. So we can think about glucose in this form, in this space-filling form, or just as those carbon molecules with those oxygens and hydrogens. So really this slide has everything you need to know, with the exception of one more slide. We've got starch, glycogen, and cellulose. It's all about how these glucose molecules are linked together. And we're going to see that starch and glycogen are used as energy storage. In starch, it's energy storage for plants. Glycogen, like us, this is how we store our glucose to use for energy. So it's a lot more branched, but it's still just these long chains. They're really easy for us to cut up when we need some sugar. This is in contrast to cellulose. Cellulose has a different linkage, which I'll show you in a second, which ends up forming these strong hydrogen bonds, and it forms these sheets which make up cellulose. What cellulose is it's the plant cell wall. It's actually the most abundant organic molecule on Earth. And it's what we make paper out of. It is very, very strong, but it's actually not able to be broken down by most animals. So you can eat all the grass you want and you're not going to taste a whole bunch of sugar because we can't break these bonds down to get back out one of these glucose molecules. And that's why we call cellulose fiber, because we cannot break down cellulose because we don't have the enzymes, we don't have the scissors to break these bonds. So it goes right through us. So cellulose is a structural component, is a structural polymer, and that's in plants. And then the last structural polymer is found in animals, in arthropods. It's actually the exoskeleton. So when you see a cicada carcass when it's left its hard exoskeleton shell, that shell is made up of chitin. What chitin is a glucose molecule with a nitrogen and a hydrogen, a carbonyl group, and a methyl group. You need to now be able to recognize these different functional groups based on their chemical formulas or showing their structural formulas. But again, so there's 4 types of polysaccharides you need to know. 2 of them are structural. That's chitin and cellulose. And then the 2 for energy are starch, long, no branching, and glycogen, long and branching.